you can think of that from a Piagetian sense too, because it's a game, but imagine that if you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around other people, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know where the boundaries of your body are, you know, and you don't know how much you can take and how much you can be stretched and how much you can be thrown around and when something actually hurts rather than is frightening. And so all of that intense sort of play that boys in particular are likely to engage in, although girls also like it, seems to be very useful for teaching children about how to engage with the world and with other people in a physical way, and that's one of the physiological foundations for higher order socialization. So it's very useful. I mean, I've often noted that children who haven't had the opportunity to engage in physical play, they're kind of awkward. You know, they're not seated well in their body, and it's like they're kind of vague physically, whereas the ones who've been twisted around and bent and thrown up in the air and, you know, wrestled in general, they're a lot more conscious of their limits and their abilities in their body, and they're also much more able to invite other kids to play. You can think about this with regards to dogs. You know, if you have a dog, you know the dog, you can tell when the dog wants to play, right? What does the dog do? Yeah, it jumps around and it puts its rear end in the air often and its head down and it looks up, which is a little bit submissive and a little bit friendly, and it wags its tail and it might bark and it moves back and forth. And like little kids that want to play do, well, they don't put their tails in the air obviously, but they engage in like play invitation behaviors like that, you know, a little bit of teasing sometimes, and they're trying to get some play initiated. It's also practice for later dominance. When chimps play, the males in particular, as they approach adolescence, the play behavior, because they'll throw sticks at the old chimps who are laying down and sleeping, or come up and poke them, or, you know, tease them. And then as they become more and more powerful and more adolescent, say, into adulthood, then that play will become full-blown dominance challenges, as you don't no doubt noticed if you were in junior high school, because that's exactly what happens to teachers, right? The little elementary school kids, they're kind of cute. When they misbehave, they're sort of playful, but by the time grade 8 or grade 9 comes around, the pushing on the teacher is a lot harder. And so you can see how play shades into dominance dispute. But it is a separate circuit. Exploration, that's a separate circuit. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is Swanson's elaboration of the fact that half of the hypothalamus is fundamentally devoted towards exploration, which is quite cool. It means exploration is a really, really, really old system. And it's sort of like, if you haven't got anything else to do, so you don't want to play, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not angry, you're not too warm or too cold, etc., etc., your default isn't sort of quiescent sleep, right? You don't just run out of batteries and lie on the floor, unless you're, of course, obviously, unless you're very tired. What will generally happen is if the other fundamental motivational states have been satiated, then you'll engage in exploration, and some different people at different rates. If you're extroverted, you'll engage in exploration in the social environment, and if you're open, then you'll engage in exploration at a more cognitive level. So that would be with regards to artistic creativity, or to fiction, or the expression of some sort of intellectual or philosophical pursuit. And the reason that you're wired up that way is because if you have a little extra energy, you might as well use that to map out more of the environment, so that when push comes to shove somewhere down the road, you'll be in possession of more information and more flexible and more knowledgeable in your conceptual and perceptual structures, and also in your actions. So people have a pretty strong tendency to default to exploration, but there's variability in that. You can also sort of divide up these motivations as ingestive or defensive. That's not a bad way of looking at it. And then there's reproductive motivations as well. That's unlikely to be a full map. It kind of depends on where you put the emotions, because we know, for example, that there's a separate disgust circuit, and that doesn't seem to load with anxiety or with pain. It's its own biological system, and it seems to be associated with trait conscientiousness, maybe, and also with political conservatism and orderliness. So those things are all quite interesting. They all kind of clump together. But whether that's an emotion or motivations, not exactly clear, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. So there's the hypothalamus, and as you can see, it's not one thing. Of course, nothing at the macro level in the brain is one thing, obviously. It's this layered thing, just like everything else in the world, except even more so, because the brain is so incredibly complicated. And you can see by looking at that, there's all those little, all the things that are colored there are basically hypothalamic modules, I guess would be a reasonable way of putting it. And you can tell they're even anatomically distinct, so obviously they're not doing exactly the same thing. So you might think of brain anatomy as sort of a fixed, what would you call, something that we've already managed quite well, and we have all the category systems down, and the structure of the brain's quite well known, and that's really not true at all. Like, the brain is truly terra incognita, and it isn't even, like, our naming rituals, let's say, or conventions, are not necessarily appropriate for one-to-one mapping of, say, structure onto function. So they're sort of anatomical, they're markers for anatomical convenience in some ways. Okay, so here's a way of thinking about it. So you have your frame, which specifies your lack, say I'm hungry, and then a goal pops up, which is, well, I should have something to eat, and the hypothalamus is modulating perceptual and cognitive circuits so that you think that, and so that you start to parse up the world into a place where a hungry person like you could become satisfied, and then the behaviors kick in that are relevant to that pursuit. And so you can think of yourself as popping through these sorts of frames on a fairly cyclic basis throughout the day. You know, obviously, you get hungry, you get thirsty, you get tired, and so your consciousness is being modulated by subcortical circuitry that is basically charged with your self-preservation, and in some ways you come along for the ride. I mean, your consciousness is mostly there, in some sense, to detect deviations from not so much expectation, but from desire, right? Because you lay out one of these little maps on the world, and then you want something to happen. And what your consciousness does, more or less, is monitor, and if something that you don't want to happen happens, then consciousness will take a look, in some sense. You remember that hierarchy of goals that I showed you, from, you know, motor output up to high order goals? Your consciousness kind of moves up and down that thing if you've made an error, trying to figure out at which level of abstraction that error should be rectified, which is sort of what you do when you think. And so that process is going to kick in whenever you're moving towards your desired end, and something that you don't want to have happen happens, right? You usually stop. That's sort of an anxiety response, the stopping. And then if nothing else happens that's too bad, well, then you'll start to explore. And animals often do that by moving around, but people will do that just as with equal facility, just by running simulations in their mind and trying to calculate what went wrong, right? Trying to think about it. That's a form of exploratory behavior as well that would be more associated with trait openness and with intelligence. So